Welcome. What is pitfire pottery and how do you make pitfired pots? There's a lot of misunderstandings and myth about pitfire. How can you pitfire? And can you pitfire without actually having a pit? And what is the difference between Saggar fire and pitfire, if any? How do you create the right environment for pitfire? And can you pitfire all year round? Even in the winter, when it's freezing, cold, and there's snow? What kind of clay do you have to use to pitfire? And do you have to use Terra Sigillata or some other method to burnish your pots before you pitfire them? And what colerants can you use to create these beautiful pitfire pots? And what about glazing? Can you combine pitfire and glazing either before or after? And the big question, is pitfire food safe? And do you always have to brush and seal your pots after you pitfire them? That and many more questions I'll try and answer in this video. Pitfire is, without a doubt, one of the oldest methods of firing clay. So it becomes ceramic, so it becomes useful. For thousands of years, people have found mud, clay in the ground, and they found out if they put it in the fire, it will be hard and it will be useful. It is the original way of doing ceramics. Originally, pitfire was done because that was the only way you could fire ceramics. They didn't have kilns like we do today, electric kilns, gas kilns, and wood-fired kilns. So they only had a bonfire they could put it into. But the pitfire does something magic to pots. They can create these beautiful colors. And that's the primary reason we do it today. It's actually similar to other things that was invented many years ago. I'm sort of a foodie. I like to be in the kitchen. And one of the things that I like to do a lot is fermenting. And fermenting, like smoking or salting meat, is something that was invented years ago because we didn't have fridges, we didn't have freezers. So it was the only way to preserve the food for the winter. But today, lots of people like fermented foods and play around with it. Not because we don't have other ways to preserve the food, but because it adds a nice flavor. And that's the same thing with pitfire. I have an electric kiln, I have a ragu kiln, and I have access to gas kilns and wood-fired kilns. I have many options, but still I choose this ancient way of firing because it creates something interesting. Just like many other types of firing, things of course have evolved since they started doing pitfire thousands of years ago. Back then it was probably just a bonfire, they put the pots in there. We have some traditional pots in Denmark called jydepotter. It's a very dark sort of pitfire, totally black almost. And the way they do it is in a bonfire, but then they cover it up and choke the fire, so to speak. And all the carbon from the organic materials attached to the pot, and you get this very beautiful dark color. For a long time, it was used as kitchenware in Denmark, so we cooked food in these. Also, native Indians are well known for their pit-fired pots. They usually raw fire them, so take the raw clay, put it into the bonfire, and create these beautiful pots. Sometimes they paint patterns on the pots before using other kind of clays or colorant materials. But since the old days, things have evolved. We now have different ways to create a bonfire. I use an oil drum. And the reason I do that is it's easier for me to contain and control the fire. And also, I can move it around easily. You can still dig a hole in the ground. That is the original way of doing pitfire. But if I do that in my garden, I can't easily move it around and it doesn't look so well. With the oil drum, I can move it away when I have guests or I just don't want it at the same location. So the oil drum is just a different way of creating an artificial pit. I would still call it pitfire, even though it's very different from the original way of doing it. It's actually very similar to other kinds of firing. If you look at ragu, the way that ragu was originally done hundreds of years ago in Japan is very different from the way that we do it today. The Americans got a passion for ragu and they developed the technique. We still call it ragu, even though those two things are very different. And some may claim that technically this is not ragu, what the Americans do. I don't really care. Let's just call it ragu. Some people would also claim for pitfire that unless you do it in a pit, unless you dig a hole in the ground and make a bonfire, it's not pitfire. I think that's silly. Let's just call it pitfire, no matter how you actually build that fire. It doesn't matter if you do it in a hole in the ground, or you build it with stones, or you do it in an oil drum like I mostly do. To me, it's all pitfire. The essential of it is that we fire the pots in real live fire, and we use organic materials and salts and all kinds of things to create these beautiful colors. That is, to me, pitfire, no matter what sort of bonfire you make. And now, the controversial question of Saggar versus pitfire. And I know some potters will claim, some people will claim that Saggar fire and pitfire are two different things. I don't agree. Let me just start out by explaining what Saggar fire is. A Saggar is a container that you put your pots into, you close it, and then you fire it. Originally, a Saggar was invented to protect the pot and the glazes from the dust and the ashes in a wood-fired kiln. But today we actually use it with an opposite purpose. We want to contain the organic materials and the dust and the smoke and get it attached better to the pot. You can make many different kinds of Saggars. I mostly use tinfoil. It's an easy way to create a closed space for your pots. Some people use clay containers, so they basically create a pot and they put the other pot inside that with the combustibles, the organic materials, and whatever you want. Some people use metal containers, and basically you could use anything as a Saggar. But to me, Saggar is a way to prepare your pot for a fire. The other thing is how you fire it. And the fact is, you can Saggar fire in a pit fire, like I do, or you can do it in a gas kiln or wood fire kiln as it was originally done, or you could even do it in an electric kiln. In fact, there's a book, very good book, I think, I haven't got it yet, I just ordered it, about Saggar firing in an electric kiln. It's basically the same. The idea is that you put something inside a Saggar, a container, put organic materials in there, and then you fire it. So Saggar, to me, is a way that you prepare pot, like you would do if you glaze it. And pit fire, electric fire, wood fire, gas fire is the way that you fire it. It's similar to glaze fire. I mean, you can glaze fire in all kinds of kilns. A ragu kiln, a gas kiln, an electric kiln, a wood-fired kiln, but it's still glazing. So Saggar and pit fire are not opposites. It's two things that complement each other. It's just a way to prepare your pot for whatever way you fire it. That's my opinion. I know some of you may not agree, but I think it makes life a whole lot easier when we talk about what we do. Saggar is a way to prepare a pot, and the fire, the different types of fires, are the way that we choose to fire that. But now, let's get started. The first step, of course, in doing pit fire, at least the way that I do it, is to create an environment for doing the pit fire. And as I mentioned, I do it in an oil drum. So let's check out how I prepare my oil drums for pit fire. Today, I'm going to show you how you can build your own pit fire kiln out of an oil drum. It only takes a few minutes and it's super cheap to do. To build the kiln, first of all, you need, of course, the oil drum. And there are at least two different kinds of oil drums that you need to be aware of. I like these big ones. I think they're 200 liters and about 55 centimeters wide and 89 centimeters high. So it's nice and big, and you can have a lot of pottery in that. But one thing you have to be aware of is that one kind have the lid sort of welded onto it or hammered onto it, and you can't really remove it, so you need to cut it off. That doesn't work for the Pitfire kiln. This one have this, I don't know what you call it, but you can loosen the lid like this. You can take this off. We're not going to use this, so you can throw that away. And now the lid is easy to take off. So we can take it off and we can put it back after we're done with the initial fire. So that's the basic. Then you need a couple of tools. It's actually very little. You need a drill and you need some good drill bits. I found that even though this is not steel, it's just iron. So most drill bits will be able to go through this. But what I found is that it's so much easier if you invest in some steel drill bits. This one was quite cheap in a builder's market because it just goes so much easier when you drill it. I use the biggest ones in the kit. I think it's 10 millimeters, so 1 centimeter. That seems to be sufficient. So what we need to do is we wanna drill some holes to be able to get some suction, some air into the oil drum when we fire it. So what I'm doing, and I found that to work really well, is I drill a few holes at the bottom, and I drill a few holes relatively low, so about 5 centimeters, and I'm going to show you later why. And then I'm going to drill some a little higher up here. So let's get on with that. Oh yeah, one thing, when you do drill this, remember to wear a mask, because sometimes these metal pieces fly out and you definitely don't want to get that in your eyes. So be careful with that. I also use some gloves because, again, it can be a little bit sharp and stuff, so you don't want to hurt yourself. So let's get on with the drilling above the bottom, and then I'm going to drill some that are maybe 20 centimeters. In the end of this video, I'm going to show you why. I found this grill in a builder's market. I think it's made for grilling meat on a bonfire, but I found that it works really well for my oil drum to create a suction of air from underneath. I use a couple of stones and I put them in the bottom of the oil drum, and that kind of gives it a little bit of space down there for the air to flow into the oil drum. Then I put the grill on top of this, and that will create like a suction of air underneath the actual fire and up through the pots. It's very effective and it works really well for me. So that's it. It is, as I said, super easy. Once you have your pit fire environment, the hole in the ground or the oil drum or whatever you choose to use, you need to make some pots for the actual pit fire. And of course you can theoretically do it any way you want, but there are a few conditions that you need to keep in mind. So let's take a look at how I make the pots and what kind of clay I use to create pots that I think is suitable for pit fire. Theoretically, you can use all kinds of clay for pit fire, but it is a very brutal way of firing clay. Sort of like ragu can be. The raise in temperature and the drop in temperature is very rapid, and therefore not all clay will survive, at least theoretically. I have tried with porcelain and I got away with it sometimes, and it can look really, really beautiful if you get away with it, but the risk is higher. Some people have asked me if you can use earthenware, and I think you can. I never did it myself. The thing about earthenware is that it melts at a much lower temperature than stoneware and porcelain. But a pit fire, a fire, doesn't get to the temperature where I would think, in most cases, the earthenware would melt. So it is safe from that. If you ever tried to, by accident, mix up earthenware and stoneware in a fire that reached like 1200, 1300 degrees Celsius, you know exactly what I mean. This is an example of a pot I did a few years ago, it has been wood-fired. It is stoneware, but on a shelf above this, there were also some pots, and one of them, by mistake, was earthenware. And at 1300 degrees, cone 11, something like that, in a wood fire, earthenware melts. It becomes a glaze. And lucky for me, it melted into this bowl and actually created something really, really beautiful. It also destroyed one of the shelves, which was a bad side effect. So if you try that, you know what I mean. So when it comes to stoneware, basically you can have stoneware with grog and stoneware without grog. You can get some high grog stoneware that are made for raku, and those ones are probably going to be your most safe bet that will survive in the pit fire. I have got away with stoneware with very little grog, but it is a little more safe with the higher grog stoneware. So if you go for raku stoneware, that should put you on your safe side. Less grog than that should also do. Most of the stoneware I use for pit fire have about 20-25% small grog, and that seems to go fine. Very little of that is cracking. So the next question is the color of the clay. The colerants we use for pit fire are very fragile. They're not as strong, and they don't put a layer like glaze do on top of your pot. So you're very dependent on the color of your surface. That's why porcelain can look so amazing if you get away with it in a pit fire, because it's super white. In general, I would recommend that you try and get as light a surface as possible, close to white, because then you have a sort of a clean canvas to work on with your pit fire colors. So if you can find a stoneware that is very light, that's a good starting point. I also work a lot with a stoneware that is high on iron. So that makes it very red brownish. And it also have a lot of grog. It's actually 40%, but a very fine grog, so it doesn't feel very groggy. You can still get a super smooth surface. It is not specifically made for raku or pit fire, but it is extremely strong. It can sustain almost any thermal shock. And one of the tests I once made with it is maybe the most brutal way of firing anything you can do is obvara. I don't know if you know that, but it's a technique where you heat up the pot, typically in a raku kiln. You take it out when it's warm, and it have to be like 800, 900, 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is like super hot. You take it out and you dip it into this this mix of flour and yeast and water, like a very, very watery type of dough. It's typically cold, so you go from 1,000 degrees to maybe 10 degrees. That is a very dramatic shock to give any kind of clay, and it has to be super, super strong to sustain that. But this is an example of this clay that I used for an obvara test. I don't particularly like the outcome, the design of it, but some people do. And it was more to test to what extreme I could treat this clay, and this survived. So that is a very strong clay, and I never had any problem either when I do pit fire with this, except because it have this dark surface. The very delicate colors of pit fire just are more difficult to stick to it. It can be done. This is a vase I did some time ago, and you can see this is the dark red clay, and it actually came out really, really beautiful. But I have to say that I put a lot of very strong colorants: ferric chloride, cobalt carbonate, cobalt sulfate, and a few more things, some copper wire around it. You can see the stripes here. So I used the strongest colorants that I can use in a pit fire, and that made it come out, I think, very beautiful. But I would normally recommend that you pick a more light surface to work on. To get a easy start with your Pitfire pottery, I'll suggest either you take a very light stoneware with some grog in it, or you take another stoneware and you apply slip, porcelain, or Terra Sigillata, or a combination thereof, and use that as a starting point. Before I start throwing, I want to talk a little bit about shapes, because not all shapes are created equal, so to speak. some shapes are more difficult to get through Pitfire in one piece. This sort of shape is, in my experience, one of the easiest ones to get good results with. It's a straight form, got a big hole in the top, and so the heat can, get in and out, and can heat it up equally. So this is a good shape, in my experience, or at least an easy shape. I also did a lot of these with narrow necks. They also tend to be okay, but sometimes not, and they're a little more fragile in the neck. And of course the heat cannot, get in and out as quickly. So they're a little more fragile, but still have a high success rate. I've also done quite a few bowls, and they can come out so beautiful. I mean, I really, really love this bowl. This is, of course, with some vivid colors. This is more smoke fired, also very beautiful. But in my experience, these open forms, the bowls, are the most difficult to survive in Pitfire. I'm not 100% sure why. I tried firing them upside down, that didn't help. I tried put them in the top and in the bottom, and it's just a very high degree of breakage with the open forms. But of course, shouldn't keep you from doing it. It's just so you know, at least my experience with the open forms are not as good as the closed forms. Because there's no glaze applied to your pit-fired pots, they won't be as shiny as the ones that you do with glazing. Unless, that is, that you burnish them before you actually fire them. And that is what most people would do with Pitfire. That is what I most often do. And there are two ways to get a shine on your pot before you fire it. One of the traditional ways of doing it is to burnish the clay. You basically take it and you use a spoon or a shiny stone or something, and you burnish the clay. What you do is you press down the stones and little grinds into the clay, and if you do this enough, it will create a very shiny surface. But it's a lot of work, and I'm sort of lazy. So instead, I'm using a different method. I'm using Terra Sigillata. Terra Sigillata is the very small particles of clay, very watered down, so it's almost like water, but just a little bit of clay in it. These very, very fine clay particles, when you apply that to the pot, they sort of fill out those little holes that makes it less shiny. And then after you apply it, you polish it, and then you get a very high shine without actually doing all the work of burnishing your pot. I have a couple of videos about how you apply Terra Sigillata and how you mix your own Terra Sigillata. I will put a link to that in the description below, maybe also up here somewhere. But that is at least an option. But you don't have to use it. You don't have to have a shiny pot. I actually made a couple of more matte pot. Let me just pick. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to do anything. You can do it in your own way. But you don't have to do that. You can also have a pit-fired pot that is not shiny, and in fact, it can be really beautiful. I made some textured pots that are difficult to burnish and difficult to apply Terra Sigillata to, and I think actually turns out really interesting too. So this is not shiny, but it's still really interesting in my mind. So do whatever you like, but traditionally, most pit-fired pots have this burnished or Terra Sigillata surface to make it shiny. Many of you have asked me if you can do Pitfire all year round, or it's something you can only do in the summer when it's warm, it's not rainy, it's not too cold. But no, I have done Pitfire. I live in Denmark, and half the year it's sort of cold and rainy, and in the winter it can even get freezing and snowy. I do Pitfire all year around. Of course, it's a little more pleasant to do Pitfire in the summer. You're out there and it's warm in your t-shirt and stuff. But if you put a sweater on and prepare for whatever weather it is, you can do it. The only thing is, if it's rainy, it's difficult to prepare your pots because all the stuff that you put on, the oxides and stuff, it will just rain off before you even start the fire. So if it is rainy, I usually don't do pit fire, also out of convenience. I don't like to stand out there all evening in the rain. But if it's a little bit rainy, I prepare my pots inside where it's dry, and then I take them out into my oil drum kiln. Also, if it's in the winter time, it is a little bit cold to stand out too long. So I prepare my pots inside, and then when I go out and I start the fire, I get some heat from the fire and it's okay. But from a technical point of view, there's no problem. Because the fire is hot, it doesn't matter if it's plus 20 or minus 20 outside. As long as the fire is going, everything works fine. The only thing, of course, is that it's probably gonna cool down a little bit faster if it's very cold outside versus when it's very warm. But I haven't actually found any big difference in the results. This is an example of a pit fire I did this winter, and if you look at the results, they look very similar to what I've done in the summertime. One of the questions I get the most is if you have to bisque fire your pots before you pit fire them. So just in case you're not sure about all these different stages of firing, the bisque fire is when you take the raw clay that you formed into some sort of a pot. It's very fragile at this stage. It's basically just dry mud. I always bisque fire my pots before I do pit fire. And I do it primarily because it is so fragile. And the way that I fire, where I stack all the pots in the oil drum, would make it too risky. They fall on each other, and before they actually become ceramics, before they reach a temperature where the very fragile clay becomes ceramic, hard material, if they fall on each other, they will break. So I do it that way. But I know that there are other potters that raw fire or single fire pit fire. It can be done. Technically, there's no problem with that. And I think originally pit fire was just a one-stage fire where you took the pots, you made the raw mud or the greenware and put it into your bonfire and you fired it. I would think, I don't have done it, but I've seen other potters do it, you probably need to fire it up a little bit slower. Because if you put a raw pot, greenware pot, an unfired pot into a very hot kiln, I think there's a higher risk that it will explode. But that's something you have to experiment with. I think a safe way to do pit fire is to bisque fire it first and then do the pit fire afterwards. However, you have to keep in mind that the higher temperature you bisque fire, the more the clay vitrifies, it's called. That means that the little clay particles melt together and they sort of close the pores in the clay. And the more close it is, the less it's going to absorb the colors from the organic materials and oxides and salts and whatever you have. So if it's bisque fired too high, it's going to be less colorful in my experience. So that's something you have to keep in mind. It also depends on the clay you're using and the color of the clay. There's so many factors that I can only give you like general guidelines and based on my experience. So I encourage you to go and do your own testing with your clay and your way of firing, your colerants. So the next step, after you created your kiln and you created your pots and you may have bisque fired them, is of course to do the actual pit firing. And for that, you most likely want some colors. You can also just put it into the kiln, the oil drum or the bonfire, whatever you do, and use the organic colors you get from the wood, because that's going to create some colors. Most likely it's going to be smoky colors, so gray and black. That can actually look really beautiful. I made some completely black, almost completely black pots using that method. I added some sawdust to get even more smoke and get this smoke-fired look on my pots. Some people love that. You can see parts of this pot have elements of that, if you look at this. And this really deep, dark color is actually very beautiful. But for most of us, we want these more vivid colors of pit fire. And to do that, you can use a whole range of materials. Basically, you could say that there's organic materials, combustibles, and for that you can use almost anything. But it can be really difficult to predict what colors comes out of it. It has to do with the origination of that. I mean, you can take seaweed, for example. Some seaweed, beautiful purplish, yellowish colors. Some seaweed just turns black. And of course, the kind of seaweed you have may be different than what we have in Denmark. So again, I can't give you like specific advices on it, but try out different seaweed. Seaweed can be really, really beautiful. The same thing comes with manure. A lot of people use dry cow manure. I used chicken shit because I used to have chickens. I don't have right now. Probably get it again. That looked very beautiful too. But the colors depend very much on what the animals have been eating. So that's all the organic materials. I also use a lot of nuts and leaves and different kinds of shells. And, basically everything organic have carbon in it, and they have some chemicals that will be released when it's fired. I also use banana peels, corn leaves, coffee grounds. There's no limit to what organic materials you can try out. And the combination of that, your clay, the way you fire, will create different colors, and you have to experiment with that. Another category of colorants are salts and oxides. I very often use some salt, and I very often use copper carbonate. It can create very nice reddish colors if it's the right atmosphere, or greenish if it's a different atmosphere. Also use cobalt carbonate, and I use a lot of sulfates. The sulfates, I use it dissolve in water, and I add them to the pot before I put them into the fire. I use a lot of ferric oil. It creates a beautiful orange or deep red color. All the sulfates, however, you have to be a little bit careful. It's also what's called soluble salts, because they can absorb through your skin. So you want to wear gloves when you use that, because you don't want these toxic materials to go into your bloodstream. So just be aware. The same thing applies when you start firing. The smoke can be toxic, so don't stand in the wind or use a proper mask when you're close to it. But unlike what some potters think, that is only copper and cobalt and stuff like that when you fire it that is toxic, that's not true. Even just regular smoke is not good for your lungs. We all should know that. But also salt. I mean, salt looks very innocent, right? But when you heat up salt to a certain degree, it releases chloride fumes. And chloride fumes are not very good. So definitely you want to protect yourself when you start the fire. But do experiment with all these different materials. It can create really beautiful results. Let's take a look at some of the pots that I made, some of the fires I made, and see the different results. I'm not even sure what I use for all of them, but I love it. I've been looking now for a few minutes on these pots, and I'm over the top. I think I can say safely this has been the best fire ever. 10 vases and 3 bowls in one fire. I think that's a pretty good outcome. And some of them I think is beautiful. Some of them I think I may want to refire, add some more colors. But that's something you can always do. That's it. That's all the pots that I got out of it. And there was 3 pots that cracked. So but we have another 15 or so that turn out really nice. Another question I get a lot is about glazing. Can you combine pitfire with glazing? And I think the reason people ask is because pitfire is by nature not as waterproof as glazed pots. With glazed pots, you have a layer of glaze, so no water is going to get through. And there's a lot of good things to be said about glazing. So why not combine glazing and pitfire? For a long time, I didn't believe that was possible because I was told so. I read so in books. All these wise people told me it wasn't possible because basically if you glaze first, You're going to fire up to a temperature where the clay vitifies, and if it vitifies, you won't get any colors in the pit fire. Or if you glaze after you pit fire, you're also getting up to a high temperature, and that high temperature is going to burn away all the beautiful colors from the pit. Now, that turned out not to be entirely true. I did some tests where I glazed some pots first, and then afterwards I pit fired it. So basically I just glazed them on the inside to make them, to seal them, to make them completely waterproof. And then I used Pitfire on the outside, and turned out you can actually do it. It is a little more difficult because the clay is vitified, so the colors don't attach as much as they do when the pot is more porous, but indeed you can do it. I'll just take it out here. And all the combustibles burned. And now take a look at this. This is indeed very, very exciting. Look at this. This is classic pit fire. It is beautiful, almost metallic. That's probably because of the strong reduced atmosphere in the Saggar. Nice. There's even some red areas here and some beautiful shades of gray and black. And the inside, of course, is glazed. So now we have a pit-fired porcelain vase, 100% waterproof, glazed on the inside, pit-fired on the outside. I would call that a success. I have not done the other thing, pit-fire first, glaze later, but one of my good friends here in Denmark have done it and turned some good results out of it. It is possible. So once again, when people tell you this or that cannot be done, or you should always do it this way, don't trust them. Don't even trust me. Make your own experiments. Sometimes these so-called experts are right. Sometimes they're not. Only you can know for sure if you try it out yourself. Another big question that I get a lot is pit fire food safe? That is actually a much more complicated question than most people realize. I made a whole video about food safety and pottery. Basically, food safety is not a global standard. So what we consider food safe in Denmark may not be the same as they consider food safe in Japan or in the US or in Germany. The fact is, raku is by definition not food safe legally in Denmark. And yet, in Japan, they've been drinking tea and making food in raku pots for thousands of years, and I think they sort of survived. So that's the first thing. You have to apply a region to your question about food safety if you want to talk about the legal definition of food safety. But personally, I more look at it from a personal point of view. Is this something that I would feel safe about eating of? And if you go back in history, most kitchenware was made with low-fire pottery or pit-fired sort of pottery, and we ate out of that. And I don't think it is as toxic as some people would claim, but that's just my personal opinion. But there is a second part to it, and that is maybe there's not something in the clay that is toxic in itself, but because it is porous, theoretically, of course, bacteria could harbor into these little cracks, and it's difficult to clean it, and over time that may make it less food safe. But let's take a quick look at the video I did about food safety. That should explain a lot more about it. Welcome! Today we're going to talk about how you can make pit-fired pottery food safe. And yeah, I know some people will claim that it's not possible because pit-fired pottery is by nature not food safe. But that's not entirely true. You can, in fact, make your pit-fired pottery food safe. But there are a lot of things that you have to consider doing that. Another thing to consider in food safety is what kind of food you store in your pot and how frequent you're going to use it. If we take, for example, the Japanese tea ceremonies, as I understand it, I'm not an expert in Japanese culture, it's an infrequent ceremony. So it's not something you do 5 times a day, something you do on occasions. They use these little raku-fired cups. And I don't know in Japan if it's considered food safe or not, but I do know for a fact that in Denmark, and I think most of Europe, maybe even the US, raku-fired pottery is not considered food safe. But does it kill them? I don't think so. I mean, Japanese people get really old and they've been using these teacups for centuries, millenniums maybe even. So if it's like an infrequent use, yeah, maybe, strictly speaking, it's not food safe, but it's probably not going to kill you either. For me, I have been doing these pitfired bowls for a long time, and even before I started using food safe sealant, I've been using them to serve certain kind of things. For example, if it's bananas or oranges or avocados, anything basically that have a thick skin that you peel off before you eat the inside, personally, I wouldn't be afraid of it. This is more of a practical food safety advice. It's not legal advice. If you want to commercialize your pottery, then of course you need to look at the legal aspects. In the other end of it, if you want to use a bowl for a salad with citric dressing, then you're more likely to run into problems. You can also do that with glazes that leach from the acid, or if you use if you make a small jar for pickled vegetables with a lot of acid in, that can also extract chemicals that you don't want in your food. So consider what you're going to put in, and consider how frequent you use it and how long you're going to store it. Because putting a couple of bananas in this bowl, putting it on the table, eating it after dinner, I'm pretty sure that's not going to be dangerous. Anyway, having said that, there's a number of things that comes into play when you want to do food safe pitfired pottery. And let's just talk about the reasons why, as default, it's not food safe. There are 2 main reasons. One of them is that because pit-fired pottery is not fired to a very high temperature, you typically bisque it to 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. I don't know exactly what that is in Fahrenheit, but I'm thinking you can recalculate that. And then in the pit, it's often not much more than that. So anywhere between 700 and 1,000 degrees if you're really lucky, but not more than that. So that means that the clay is not fully vitrified. And so it's sort of porous. And that means that not only water, but also bacteria can hide in those little, very tiny little cracks. And that bacteria can grow, and then it moves on to the next food you put in it. That's not good. That alone doesn't make it food safe. That's why we like the glazed pieces, because it's like a glass surface. And that you can wash completely. There's no little cracks where bacteria can hide. The other thing that influences food safety is whatever materials we use in the pit fire and whether or not it can leach into the food. You can also have leaching in glazed ceramics. That's why we don't use lead anymore. That's why there's a lot of chemicals that we used to use. Uranium was used, highly toxic. And there's a lot of materials that potters used to use way back that we don't use anymore for that specific reason. And there are also glazes that is not considered food safe. Even if you fire them to a high degree and they have this glassy surface, they can still leach some dangerous chemicals into your food. So you can't use them for food. You can still use them for decorative pieces. But with pit fire, we don't have that glaze layer. So whatever materials you have used, if it's not protected otherwise, it can very easily leach into your food. And so if you're using cobalt and copper and lots of other materials, it's obvious that's not very good to get in your food and get in your body. That's just not good. So that's the other thing. So in order to make your pit-fired pottery food safe, first of all, you need to use materials that is not toxic. And there's a lot of materials you can use that is not actually toxic. You can use salt, you can use organic materials, leaves and nuts and all kinds of combustibles that is not in itself toxic the way that cobalt and copper and stuff like that is. So that is the first step. Of course, then there's a challenge of how you actually get colors, and yeah, you don't get super flashy, super red, green, blue colors if you want to do food safe pit-fired pottery. But you can still, play around with certain colors from organic materials that can still look good. This is a good example. It looks a little more blue on the video. In fact, it's not so blue. It's white and dark. There's some red, but the red here comes from steel wool, and that doesn't leach any toxic ingredients into your food. And out here it's just carbon from the fire, and so this doesn't have any toxic materials in it. So that's the first step. But then this pot is still porous, so bacteria could still hide. And also, it's not good to use for anything watery because it will soak into and it will take forever to dry. So that's not good. So you need something that can seal it. Most of the sealants I'm using like a concrete sealer, which is very good. It keeps it completely water safe, but it's not food safe. It's not approved for food as such. And other materials like wax may not completely seal it, and still it's made for furniture, it's made for floors, it's made for bowling alleys or whatever type of wax people are using. It's not food safe. It's not made for food. I was looking a long time to find something that actually works for food, and then I stumbled on this company in Australia that makes this wonderful product called liquid quartz. And I don't know if you can see the label here. Yeah, there it goes. Liquid quartz. It is, let me just say that, it is incredibly expensive. I don't even want to say how much I paid for this bottle, and I had to pay import taxes and all kinds of shit, but you can find out on their website. But when you break it down, because you actually use very, very little, so when you break it down on a per pot, it's only a few dollars for each pot. And I think compared to what glazing and heating up your kiln cost, then I actually think it's not too bad. This liquid quartz is a nanoparticle product, meaning that it's very, 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 very small particles of quartz. Quartz in itself is not a toxic ingredient, but the thing about this is that the particles are so small that they actually go into the pores of the porous ceramics that comes out of your pit fire, and it completely seals it off. And it is very easy to apply, and I'm just going to show that. So I'm just going to get a couple of ingredients to do that. There are many ways that you can apply the liquid quartz. You can pour it, you can dip it, you can brush it on, which is what I'm going to do today. The good news is that you can't apply too much, because when you apply it, and you will see that when you do it, it instantly seals the holes and make it waterproof. So when you apply more, it just glides off. So it's not like a paint or something where you can apply too much and then it peels off or something. It doesn't. I mean, it soaks in whatever it needs to close the holes, and then nothing more will soak into it. So it's actually very, very easy. I have this bowl. It may not be the most elegant, but at least it's in one piece, and there's no toxic elements in this. So I'm going to apply the liquid quartz to that. As I said, I'm going to use a brush today because I found that it's a very easy way to apply it. And I'm going to put some of it up in this bowl. So I can brush it from this instead of the bottle. Here we have the liquid, and of course I cleaned the bowl. I brushed it with a little bit of steel wool, and I wiped all the dust off with just a little bit of water, and I let it dry. So now it is completely ready. You want to make sure that it's completely dry before you apply the liquid quartz, because otherwise you're going to trap water inside the clay, and we don't want that. So basically we're going to apply this, and the first layer you put on, it looks a little bit like water. But now, you see, now we actually have the first layer on, and it's soaked into it. So now when you see, when I'm trying to apply more, I hope you can see it on the video, but as I'm trying to apply more, it just rolls off, because now the little pores have been closed off, and it just doesn't take any more in. So whatever I apply now is just going to float down to the bottom of the bowl. So you can go over it a few times just to make sure that you didn't miss any spots, because again, you're not going to apply too much, you're not going to waste anything. Of course, if you're going to do a lot of pots, it may be easier to just dip it. And as you may also see, it didn't do anything to the surface. It's completely transparent. There's no smell to it, I can tell you. You can't see on the video, but there isn't. And it just doesn't do anything. So now the bowl have dried. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's nothing to see. As I said, it doesn't change the surface at all. It's not any more smooth or any more anything. It basically looks and feels exactly the same. The only difference is now it's waterproof and it's food safe. So let's try and see how to react when we put, for example, water into it. And I hope that you can see it if I do it like that. Yeah. Can you see? It's like glass. It's just rolling off like, yeah. It feels almost like a glass surface. It definitely doesn't absorb into the pot at all. So let's move on and try with red wine and see how that goes. Let's try on the white surface here. Same thing. It's just basically not absorbing at all. I mean, it does look like there's something left there, but it's not. It's just because there's some on the surface, like the drips. So let's pour that out and see. And again, I'm just gonna wipe it because of course there could be some drips left on the surface. I think I got the left of it. And as you see, there's nothing. It's exactly the same color as it was before. It's not absorbing into the pot. I would say this is a food-safe, pit-fired bowl. In my personal opinion, I think that it's more likely that people die from the bad food that they're eating than the pot they're eating it from. But that's just my opinion. When you are finished with your pots and you take them out in the kiln, they don't look as good as these ones do when I did the last step. This is another good example of a dusty pot. I just took it out of the kiln. It's still a little bit warm, not too much, but as you can see, it's matte. The colors are not shining, and of course there's all this tin foil left over. And of course, I mean, actually you could exhibit it like that, but it wouldn't last for long because it's falling off very easily. So we need to get this off. In the first stage, we're just gonna remove it with the hands. I usually brush off all the dust and clean them, scrape off if something burned into it. And then I apply a layer of wax or acrylic spray or some sort of treatment. It will make it a little more shiny. It will make it easier to clean. You won't have any finger marks. The second part of it is the inside. Because the problem is that because of the porosity of the pit-fired clay, because it haven't been up to a temperature where it's fully vitrified, it is not by default waterproof. But I found materials, I have some local materials that is used in the industry to seal the pots. And that can actually make them completely waterproof. Now these materials are made for industrial use, so they're not food safe. But for a vase like this, it doesn't matter. And it actually works. That's all I had today, and I know it's a lot. Pitfire is a very complex process, but it's also very enjoyable. Not only for the fact that playing with fire is always fun, but also because we can create something really unique pottery that way. And I hope that you will feel inspired by this video to go and do Pitfire yourself. It is by far the cheapest way of getting started with pottery. You don't need an expensive electric kiln. You don't need the physical facilities of building a wood-fired kiln or a gas kiln. You can just go ahead in your backyard and make pottery. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you feel inspired. If you did, please write a comment, subscribe, share. If you do subscribe, you'll be notified about new videos. And I try to get a new video out every Sunday at 5 p.m. Central European Time. So until then, have a nice day.